The scream came before the soup. It cut through the long dining hall of Ravensmere Hall with the abruptness of a snapped violin string, and for a single suspended instant every silver spoon hovered above its china rim, as though propriety itself had been wounded and was deciding how to respond. Then chairs scraped, napkins fell, and Lady Marchmont half rose with a small pale gesture that conveyed both alarm and the lifelong inconvenience of being well bred in dramatic situations. "Good heavens," murmured Colonel Pettigrew, "what in blazes—" The scream had come from the drawing-room beyond the carved oak doors, and it was followed not by another sound, but by something more unsettling, a thick, listening cadence. Hercule Poirot, seated at the lady's left hand, set down his spoon with a deliberation that suggested he had been expecting a disturbance, though perhaps not quite this one. He had been observing, with quiet pleasure, the pair of George III's silver candlesticks at the centre of the table, twin sentinels of the polished light, and noting that the left-hand one stood a quarter-inch forward of its twin, as though some impatient hand had nudged it during the seating, and the servants had not seen fit to correct the symmetry. A small thing, a small telling thing. He rose. "Madame," he said softly to his hostess, "perhaps it would be wisest if you remained." But Lady Marchmont was already moving, and the rest of the company surged after her in a polite stampede of evening dress and apprehension. Her stepson Rupert Marchmont, with his too easy smile now neatly folded away, her niece Cordelia, who had grown white about the mouth, the Reverend Mr. Asprey, dabbing his moustache, Miss Vane, the companion, whose hands had begun a small repetitive smoothing of her skirt, and Mr. Theodore Quince, the family solicitor, breathing rather heavily for a man who had not yet exerted himself. The drawing-room door stood open. Within, the curtains had been drawn against an October dusk, and the lamps cast their amber discipline over Persian rugs and lacquered tables. On the hearthrug, between the fender and the writing-desk, lay Sir Edmund Marchmont, the master of Ravensmere, decorated soldier, collector of jade, husband of 7 years to the woman, now staring down at him without yet permitting herself to scream again. He was very obviously dead. A small ornamental paper knife of Chinese workmanship protruded from beneath his left collarbone, at an angle which had clearly been efficient. There was very little blood. The wound had not asked for much. Sir Edmund's right hand was open, fingers slightly curled, as though he had been about to receive something, or just let something fall. His left hand was clenched, but loosely, in the manner of a man surprised in mid-thought rather than mid-struggle. By the writing-desk stood the housemaid, Annie, who had screamed. Her cap was askew. She was attempting to explain in the broken syllables of a girl who had not yet decided whether to weep or apologize, that she had come in only to draw the curtains for the evening, only that, sir, and there he had been, just as he was, only she hadn't touched him, she would never, "Quite," said Poirot, with a kindness that gathered her up like a hand under an elbow. "You will sit, mademoiselle. There. Yes, breathe." He did not, however, look at her. He was looking at the desk. On its leather surface lay a sheet of cream notepaper, half written upon in Sir Edmund's small deliberate hand. A pen rested on a blotter beside it, the nib still wet enough to throw back a glint of lamplight. Poirot's eyes travelled over the visible words without permitting his head to incline. The company would later remember only that the little Belgian had stood very still for the space of 3 heartbeats and then folded his hands precisely before him. "No one," he said in a voice quiet enough to be obeyed, "is to approach the desk." Rupert Marchmont, who had taken half a step forward, halted with the smoothness of a man unaccustomed to being told to halt. "I beg your pardon. He was my father." "Stepfather," said Cordelia, without quite knowing she had said it. She put her hand to her mouth as though to catch the word back. A small thing, a small telling thing. Lady Marchmont lowered herself slowly onto the arm of the sofa. She did not weep. She looked, instead, at the pair of silver candlesticks on the mantelpiece, the matched companions of those upon the dining table, and Poirot, following the line of her gaze without seeming to, observed that here, too, the left-hand candlestick stood a quarter-inch in advance of its mate, as though in this room also some impatient hand had been at work, and no servant had thought to correct the symmetry. "Monsieur Poirot," whispered Miss Vane, the companion, in a voice so thin it scarcely disturbed the air. What does one do?" "One observes, mademoiselle," he replied. "One observes, and one is patient, and one does not say what one is thinking. Above all, one does not say what one is thinking. He turned then and surveyed the assembled household with the gentle, unblinking attention of a cat at a mouse-hole. 7 faces. One of them, he was already certain, had screamed inwardly at exactly the same moment as the housemaid Annie, but had not had the discourtesy to be heard. It would be, he reflected with a small inward courtesy of his own, an evening which required of him not energy but patience, not speed but symmetry. He folded his hands more precisely before him. Somewhere within the house a clock chimed the 3/4 hour, gently as though apologizing for the lateness of its observation, and the small chime hung upon the air a long moment before it gave up its hold and was gone. Section 2? One does not say what one is thinking, Poirot repeated more softly, and the sentence had the curious effect of arranging the room. Colonel Pettigrew cleared his throat under the great social instrument of the English gentleman in a crisis, and proposed with admirable redundancy that someone ought to telephone for the police. Mr. Quince, the solicitor, agreed at length, and with the air of a man relieved to find a procedural use for himself. He moved to the hall. The others heard the small, regulated sounds of the receiver being lifted, of a number requested, of an officialdom invoked. Poirot, meanwhile, did not move from the threshold of the drawing-room. He stood with his small neat shoes precisely parallel, and observed in turn the carriage of each shoulder, the disposition of each pair of hands, the angle at which each chin was held against the air. It is in such small dispositions, he had long since learned, that a household tells the truth before it has decided what truth to tell. Lady Marchmont's hands lay loose in her lap. Her face had the smoothness of porcelain newly washed, too smooth perhaps for a widow of 7 minutes standing. But Poirot had long ago abandoned the foolishness of believing grief wore a uniform. Rupert Marchmont stood by the fender, one hand resting upon the marble with deliberate negligence, the other thrust into the pocket of his dinner jacket. His eyes had gone to the desk and had not yet left it. He was a man of perhaps 30, with a handsome mobile face that had been spoiled at some early point by the discovery that it was handsome. Cordelia, Sir Edmund's niece by his first marriage, had folded herself into the corner of the Chesterfield as though hoping the upholstery would absorb her. She was 22, freckled, plainly dressed in a colour her aunt had chosen, and her eyes were red around the rims in a manner that suggested they had been red before the scream. The Reverend Mr. Asprey was murmuring something not quite a prayer. Miss Vane, the companion, had retreated to the piano stool and seated herself upon it sideways, hands clasped, her knuckles white as eggshell. She was, Poirot judged, somewhere near 40, the sort of woman who had been pretty at 22 and was now invisible at gatherings by the careful design of her employers, and Annie, the maid, sat upon the very edge of the chair where Poirot had placed her, snuffling decorously into her apron. "Mr. Poirot," said Lady Marchmont at last, without raising her eyes from her hands. "Edmund had no enemies." "Madame," said Poirot very gently, "every man of property has enemies. It is the chief inconvenience of property." She permitted herself for the first time a small brittle smile. "You are direct. I am Belgian, madame. We have not the leisure to be otherwise." Rupert laughed, a short, mirthless sound, and turned his face away. Poirot noted the laugh, and noted too that Cordelia had flinched at it as though at a slap. He moved at last with the small neat steps that had carried him through so many drawing-rooms of catastrophe towards the desk. He did not touch the half-written letter. He bent above it instead, hands clasped behind him, and read what was visible without disturbing the paper. "My dear Henshaw, I must trouble you again upon the matter of the codicil. Since our last conversation I have come to a decision which the sentence broke off mid-air, the nib having lifted, perhaps, at the sound of the door opening. The blotter beside the page was clean, the pen was wet, the inkwell was open. He was interrupted," said Poirot, half to himself, "and he did not have time to be afraid." "He never had time to be afraid, murmured Lady Marchmont. "Edmund was not a fearful man." "All men are fearful, madame," said Poirot. "Only some of them have the courtesy to conceal it." His eyes, having left the page, travelled across the desk to the small Chinese tray, which ordinarily held the master's pen rest, his sealing wax, and a tiny silver pot of black sand. The pen rest was there, the sealing wax was there, the silver pot was not. In its place upon the leather lay a faint dark ring where the pot had stood for years, and pressed its small impression into the die. A small thing, a small telling thing. Poirot did not remark upon it. He turned instead to the mantelpiece where the second pair of silver candlesticks stood. The left-hand one was, indeed, a quarter-inch in advance of its twin, and now, examining them with quiet care, he saw that the wick of the advance candle had been lit recently and trimmed, while its companion stood with the long, unburned wick of a candle untouched for weeks. "Madame," he said, "who lit this candle?" Lady Marchmont raised her head. For an instant, for the smallest fraction of an instant, her composure suffered a hairline crack and was repaired again. "I cannot say, Monsieur Poirot. The servants attend to the lamps. The candles are ornamental only." "And yet," said Poirot, "one has burned." It was at this moment that Mr. Quince returned from the telephone, breathing more heavily still, to announce that Inspector Japp himself, by the most extraordinary good fortune, was already in the neighbourhood upon another matter, and would be with them inside the hour. Rupert Marchmont smiled à sa marble a true smile this time, brief and unguarded, and said, "How very convenient." Miss Vane, on her piano stool, made a small, involuntary sound, as though something fragile had been dropped within her. Poirot heard it. He did not look at her. He looked instead at Rupert. "Convenient, monsieur," he said pleasantly, "is a word with many edges. One must be careful which one offers to the company." Section 3. Rupert's smile did not vanish so much as set, like wax cooling, into something less companionable. "I meant no offence, Monsieur Poirot." "None, monsieur, is taken. I observe only that the English language is a labyrinth, and that the unwary often meet themselves coming back." Colonel Pettigrew, who disliked French wit upon English carpets, harumphed and proposed that the ladies be removed. Lady Marchmont declined, with a steadiness that earned her the Colonel's silent disapproval, and Cordelia, invited tenderly by Miss Vane to come away, shook her head, her eyes fixed not upon her uncle's body, but upon a point above the writing-desk, where the wallpaper bore an oblong of slightly fresher rose and cream pattern, the ghost of a picture lately removed. Poirot saw this. He said nothing. He moved instead to the hearth, where the fire had been banked low for the evening, and bent to examine the grate. Among the ashes, half consumed, lay a small triangle of cream notepaper, the same cream as that upon the desk, its blackened edge curling delicately upon itself. A single fragment of writing remained legible upon the unburned tip, the letters "Ear Hens" in Sir Edmund's hand. So, then, a first attempt at the letter, abandoned and destroyed. Poirot drew the fragment from the grate with the small brass tongs and laid it, with great care, upon a folded handkerchief which he produced from his breast-pocket. He did not show it to the company. He folded the handkerchief precisely twice, and returned it to his pocket, as though restoring a small, sleeping creature to its nest. "Mr. Marchmont," he said, without turning, "your stepfather wrote to his solicitor, Mr. Henshaw in town, I presume, concerning a codicil to his will. You knew of this?" There was a pause, perhaps a half-second longer than civility allowed. "He had spoken of it," said Rupert. "In what terms?" "In the terms a man speaks of his own business, Monsieur Poirot." "Ah, then in no terms at all. I see." Poirot smiled with the gentle melancholy of a confessor. "It is a great pity. A codicil unwritten is a will unaltered. A will unaltered is, what shall we say, a status quo preserved. I find the status quo, monsieur, is so often the most interesting motive in the world." Cordelia, in the corner of the Chesterfield, made a small movement and then went quite still. Mr. Quince, the solicitor, coughed. "Monsieur Poirot, with respect, I am the family's man of business in the country. Mr. Henshaw handles only the London affairs, the larger trusts. I am not aware that any codicil was contemplated." "Then it would have surprised you also, monsieur, had it been written." "It would, sir, considerably." Poirot considered him. Mr. Quince was a stout, careful man of 50, with the slightly damp complexion of one who had taken his profession seriously, and his exercise lightly. "Mr. Quince, you dined with us this evening. You arrived at what hour?" 6, sir. I came down on the 4:15 and walked from the station." "And you saw Sir Edmund before dinner?" "Briefly, in this room. He gave me a glass of sherry." "And in what humour was he?" Mr. Quince considered. "Preoccupied, Monsieur Poirot, distinctly preoccupied. He said, let me think, he said, 'Quince, a man who tolerates a fool tolerates a thief. Will you remember that I said so?'" I confess I did not know what to make of it. I supposed it some private matter. A man who tolerates a fool tolerates a thief, repeated Poirot softly. That is a sentence to keep in one's pocket like a small sharp coin. He turned. Mademoiselle Cordelia. She started. You were fond of your uncle, I think. Yes. And he of you. I believe so. It is a curious thing, said Poirot mildly, that of all this household you alone wear no jewellery this evening. Not even the small jet brooch which I observed upon your collar at tea. Cordelia's hand went, with the swiftness of instinct, to her throat, and found nothing there. Colour rose along her neck. I must have left it in my room. I dressed in a hurry. Ah. Poirot's eyes were very kind. We dress in a hurry sometimes when we have not slept the night before. She did not answer. Her hand, refusing to be still, had begun to pluck very lightly at the seam of her sleeve, where Poirot now observed, concealed but present, a long pale thread, as of cream note-paper caught in the wool. A small thing, a small telling thing. He did not remark upon it. Lady Marchmont, with a kind of weary grace, intervened. Monsieur Poirot, must this be done now? The inspector will be here directly. We are not at our best. Madame, said Poirot with a bow, no one is ever at their best in this hour. It is precisely why this hour is useful to me. He smiled, small, formal, immovable. But by all means let us conserve our strength. Inspector Japp prefers his witnesses fresh, as he prefers his beer. A nervous laugh ran around the company, all save Miss Vane, who had not raised her eyes from her hands, and Rupert, who had moved a step nearer the mantelpiece. Poirot, drifting in his small precise way back toward the same mantelpiece, paused before the candlesticks. The advanced candle, the one lately burned, was still warm. He extended one gloved finger and, with the smallest possible nudge, restored its base to perfect symmetry with its twin. He stepped back and considered the effect. It was not pleasing. Some small disorder in the room rejected the correction, like a body rejecting a graft. The eye still hunted for the imperfection. How strange, murmured Poirot to no one in particular, that when the disorder is set right, the room continues to feel disordered, as though the disorder were not, after all, in the candlesticks. Behind him, Rupert Marchmont laughed once, softly, and turned his face away. Section 4. The laugh was not repeated, but it lingered in the room like a perfume one regrets having worn. Poirot did not turn. He continued to regard the candlesticks with an expression of mild, almost professional disappointment, as though they had failed an examination he had set them. Behind him, the small noises of the household rearranged themselves. Mr. Quince easing his weight from one polished shoe to the other, the Reverend Mr. Asprey murmuring at last a recognisable fragment of the burial service under his breath. Lady Marchmont drawing in a long, careful breath through her nose, as one does before lifting something heavy, and then the bell at the front door. Inspector Japp had arrived. He entered the drawing-room with the particular tread of a man who has been told repeatedly and at length that he is in the presence of his betters and has decided to take no notice. He nodded to Lady Marchmont with grave civility, glanced once at the body upon the hearthrug with the matter-of-fact appraisal of his trade, and then his round red face broke into a frank pleasure that was almost indecent. "Poirot, by all that's holy!" "Mon ami!" Poirot inclined his head a quarter of an inch. "You have come, as always, at the precise moment of greatest inconvenience to the murderer." "Murder, is it?" Japp's eyes returned to the paper knife. "Well, I'd not argue the toss." No, you will not need to. The instrument is small, the angle is precise, the surprise was complete. Sir Edmund was struck where he stood by a hand he had no reason to fear. A hand he knew, you mean? That also. Japp produced a notebook with the air of a man drawing a sword. Right. The household, please, names and stations. From the top. Lady Marchmont, with the calm of long breeding, gave them herself, her stepson Rupert, her late husband's niece Cordelia Sale, Miss Henrietta Vane, companion these 4 years, Mr. Theodore Quince, the country solicitor, an old friend, Colonel Pettigrew, a neighbour at dinner, the Reverend Mr. Asprey, vicar of the parish, likewise at dinner, Annie Coombs, the housemaid, and below stairs Mrs. Pell, the cook, 2 kitchen maids, the butler Hodges, and the boot boy Tom. Sir Edmund's valet, Mr. Stevens, was in London upon an errand for his master, and was not expected until the morning. Japp wrote it all down with the slow neatness of one who would later boast about his handwriting. "And the time, ma'am, that Sir Edmund last was seen?" "He left the dining hall before the soup," said Lady Marchmont. "He said he had a letter to finish, and would join us by the fish. He was not eccentric about such things, Inspector. If he said the fish, he meant the fish. He stepped out at, 20 past 7? A little after. The gong had gone at 7, and the scream was at 7:45 by the clock on the mantel." Japp looked at the clock on the mantel. The clock on the mantel had stopped at 7:31. There was a brief fragile silence, which Poirot did not disturb. Said Japp, who had a great gift for not noticing what he meant to notice later. He turned the page of his notebook. "Mr. Marchmont, where were you between the gong and the scream?" "In the dining hall, Inspector, with the rest of the company." "The whole while?" "The whole while." "Anyone able to bear that out?" "Everyone at the table, I should imagine." Colonel Pettigrew said, in the tone of a man producing a regretted truth, "He was absent perhaps 3 minutes, Inspector. He went out," he said, "to fetch his cigarette case. I noted the time because old Marchmont had begun a story about Pondicherry, and I was frankly grateful for the pause." Rupert's face did not alter. 3 minutes, repeated Japp pleasantly. "Plenty of time to fetch a cigarette case, sir." "Or to lose one's temper," said Rupert lightly. "I lost neither, Inspector." "We shall see, sir, we shall see." Japp turned. "Miss Sale?" Cordelia rose with the careful slowness of a girl who's been practising. "I was in the dining hall also, throughout." "And before dinner?" "In my room, reading." "Reading what, miss?" A pause too long. "Cowper." "Cowper. Very nice. And Miss Vane?" Miss Vane raised her head. Her colour was that of paper held to a flame, neither white nor pink, but the indecisive shade of something about to burn. I was in the small parlour, Inspector, with my needlework, from 6:30 until the gong." "Anyone with you?" "No, Inspector. I prefer to be alone with my needlework." "Very nice," said Japp, who wrote her down with great gravity. "And what's the name? Mr. Quince?" "I was in the library, Inspector, from 6:30. I had a brief on a tenancy matter to read before dinner. I came out at the gong." "Anyone able to bear that out?" Hodges brought me a glass of sherry at 7:15, I believe." "Splendid, splendid. We shall ask Hodges." Japp closed his notebook with the snap of a man laying down a chessman. "I'll want to see each of you in turn in the morning room. Hodges first, if you please." He turned to Poirot, who had said nothing throughout this catechism. "You'll sit in, of course." "I will sit in, mon ami, with great pleasure. I shall be a small, decorative figure in the corner." "Decorative," said Japp. "Right." They went out together. As they passed the candlesticks upon the mantel, Poirot's eye dropped to them with the smallest possible flicker, and rose again, unsurprised, to meet the eyes of Lady Marchmont, who had been watching him. The left-hand candlestick had moved. It stood once again a 1/4 inch in advance of its twin. "Section 5! Lady Marchmont's eyes did not flinch from his. For a single civilized heartbeat the room contained only their 2 glances, and the small deliberate fact of the candlestick between them. Then she lowered her gaze to her hands, and Poirot, with an inclination of the head so slight that it might have been a courtesy or a verdict, followed Japp from the room. The morning room had been set in order for the police. A fire had been lit. A decanter of water had been placed upon a tray. Hodges the butler stood beside it with the resigned dignity of a man whose evening had been ruined in a manner he could not, even by long training, pretend was unremarkable. "Sit, Hodges, sit," said Japp, who treated all witnesses to the same democratic discomfort. "Now then, the brandy in the library at 7:15, that was for Mr. Quince?" Sherry, sir, not a brandy. Amontillado, sir." "Sherry. Right. And Mr. Quince was in the library." "He was, sir." "You saw him there?" "I placed the glass at his elbow, sir. He was reading at the long table." "Anyone else in the library?" "No, sir." "And after that, Hodges?" "I returned to the pantry, sir, to attend to the decanters for dinner. I was there until the gong at 7. "And you saw, or heard, Sir Edmund leave the dining room at 20 past?" "I heard the door, sir. I did not see him. I was in the dining hall sideboard." Good. And the drawing-room door, Bo? Did anyone go in or out between the gong and the scream? Hodges hesitated. It was the smallest hesitation, but Poirot, who had folded himself decoratively into a corner chair, marked it. I cannot say with certainty, sir. You cannot say, or you do not wish to say? I cannot say, sir. The dining-hall door was closed. The drawing-room door is across the hall and around the corner. From the sideboard, sir, I should not necessarily have heard it. You should not necessarily. But you might have. I might have, sir. Did you? Another hesitation. I believe, sir, that I heard a door at perhaps 25 to 8. A soft door, sir, as though someone were taking care. A man's tread or a woman's? I could not say, sir. Japp closed his notebook. That's all, Hodges, for the moment. Hodges rose, bowed with the dignified neutrality of his calling, and withdrew. When the door had closed, Japp turned to Poirot. 25 to 8. 10 minutes before the scream. Plenty of time for our gentleman in the dinner jacket to slip out, drive home his point, and slip back to his story of Pondicherry. It is also, said Poirot mildly, 10 minutes for a great many other things, such as the trimming of a candle. Japp considered him. Long acquaintance had taught Japp that when Poirot grew obscure he was at his most dangerous, and the wisest course was to wait. He waited. Mon ami, said Poirot at last, consider the position. Sir Edmund leaves the dining hall to finish a letter to his London solicitor. He sits at his desk. He writes what we have seen. I have come to a decision which, he is interrupted. He does not finish. The pen rests upon the blotter, still wet. He stands, or is made to stand. The blow falls. He dies upon the hearthrug. Now, mon ami, what is missing from the desk? The silver sand-pot, you said? Yes, the sand-pot for blotting fresh ink. Used by Sir Edmund every day for 40 years. Tonight it is gone, yet there is no sand upon the page. Why is the sand-pot absent? Because the murderer required it to be absent. Required it? Why? Because the murderer used sand of his own, or rather, used sand belonging to no one. Look! Poirot drew from his breast pocket the folded handkerchief, opened it with the gravity of a relic, and displayed within it the half-burned triangle of cream notepaper from the grate. He turned the fragment with a fingertip. Upon its blackened underside, half embedded in the soot, clung 6 grains of fine black sand. This fragment, mon ami, was a first draft of the letter. Sir Edmund wrote one version, sanded it, was dissatisfied, burned it. He was beginning the second, the one which now lies upon the desk, when he died. So far, so simple. But observe, the sand here is not silver sand. It is black sand, volcanic, the kind that comes in small bottles from Italy, sold to gentlemen who travel. And the sandpot on Sir Edmund's desk held silver sand, mon ami. I have asked Hodges, always silver sand. Sir Edmund detested black sand. He said it dirtied the cuffs. Japp whistled very softly. So whoever murdered Sir Edmund either travels in Italy, or has stolen a sandpot from one who does? Yes. It is a small thing, mon ami, a small telling thing. He folded the handkerchief away. There is more, he said. The clock on the drawing-room mantel has stopped at 7:31, yet the scream came at 7:45, a discrepancy of 14 minutes. The clock was knocked in the struggle? There was no struggle, mon ami. The wound was too clean. No, the clock was stopped. By a hand, deliberately, at 7:31, to establish for a future witness that the murder had occurred at that hour, and not at the hour at which, in fact, it occurred. And the hour at which it occurred was earlier, mon ami, perhaps 8 or 10 minutes earlier, while our gentleman of the cigarette case was, in fact, out of the dining hall. Japp's eyes brightened. Then we have him. We have a man, mon ami. Whether we have him, that is another question. The obvious culprit is, like the obvious candlestick, almost always a 1/4 inch out of true. Let us send for Miss Vane. Section 6, Miss Vane came in upon Hodges' announcement with the small level tread of a woman who'd been waiting to be summoned and disliked herself for it. She seated herself upon the chair indicated and folded her hands in her lap, and Poirot, who had returned to his decorative corner, observed that the knuckles upon her left hand were a little reddened, as though she had been gripping something tightly for a long while. Miss Vane, said Japp, with the cheerful brutality he reserved for women he suspected of secrets, You've been companion to Lady Marchmont 4 years. Yes, Inspector. Found it congenial work? I have found it necessary work, Inspector. Ah, quite so. Now then, you were in the small parlour from 6:30 until the gong, with your needlework. Alone. Yes. Did anyone pass the door? I do not know, Inspector. The door was closed. Did anyone come in? No, Inspector. Did you leave the room at any point between 6:30 and the gong? A pause. No, Inspector. Poirot, in his corner, very gently uncrossed one neat foot and crossed the other. He spoke without raising his voice. Mademoiselle, forgive an old man's curiosity. The small parlour, 'tis the room with the secretaire of walnut, is it not? Yes, Monsieur Poirot. And upon that secretaire there stands, has stood for as long as I have visited this house, a small silver sand pot. Italian work, black sand within. Yes? Miss Vane's hands tightened in her lap. She did not at once reply. Yes, she said at last. And is that sand pot still there, mademoiselle? A longer pause. I do not know, Monsieur Poirot. I have not looked. Ah, said Poirot with great gentleness. 'Tis curious. So small a question, and so much delay in the answering. Tell me, mademoiselle, what is it that you have been sewing this evening? She looked up, startled. A handkerchief, Monsieur Poirot, for Lady Marchmont. Her monogram. You had it with you in the parlour? Yes. And you have it now? The question struck the room like a small pebble striking glass. Miss Vane's eyes went, before she could stop them, to her own lap, empty, and then to the small black reticule beside her chair. Her hand rose halfway to it and stopped. I must have left it in the parlour. Then it would be a small kindness, mademoiselle, if you would permit Hodges to fetch it. I should very much like to see Lady Marchmont's monogram. I am a great admirer of fine needlework. A silence. It is not finished, Monsieur Poirot. All the more interesting, mademoiselle. The unfinished work tells the truer story. She did not answer. Japp, with the tact of a brick through a window, said, Hodges, fetch the lady's needlework from the small parlour, if you please. Hodges withdrew. The silence that followed was the silence of a woman counting heartbeats. Poirot rose, with that small considerate motion that always seemed to put others at greater ease, while in fact reducing their defences, and crossed the room to stand a little behind Miss Vane's chair, his hands behind his back. Mademoiselle, he said softly, and only she heard the softness. Japp would later remember it as ordinary. We are not enemies, you and I. There is a thing you wish to tell. I would prefer to hear it from your lips, with your own colour upon it, than to extract it later in the colder light of evidence. The choice is yours. I shall not press. She did not turn her head. After a long moment she said, in a voice nearly inaudible, He was not what you all think. Sir Edmund? In every way that a woman knows of a man and does not say. And you knew. For how long, mademoiselle? 4 years. And Lady Marchmont? A small, almost soundless laugh, and bitter as quinine. Lady Marchmont knew for 7. The door opened. Hodges entered, holding before him with a butler's grave neutrality a small embroidery hoop of pale linen, half-stitched with the letter M. He placed it upon the table at Japp's elbow. Thank you, Hodges. Hodges bowed and withdrew. Japp lifted the hoop and turned it. It was as Miss Vane had said, a handkerchief, monogrammed in fine silver thread, half done. Nothing remarkable. Japp's face fell. Mon ami, said Poirot, permit me. He took the hoop from Japp's hand with great delicacy, turned it over, and considered the reverse, where by the convention of fine needlework the back of the embroidery is meant to be almost as neat as the front. The back was perfect, too perfect. Poirot's thumb explored the stretched linen and found beneath it, caught between cloth and hoop, almost invisible, a flat, folded paper. He drew it out. It was a square of cream notepaper folded once. He opened it. 3 lines in Sir Edmund's small hand, a sum, £3,000. And the words, to be paid to Miss Henrietta Vane, in consideration of services rendered and as a final settlement. Mademoiselle, you accepted it? I refused it, this afternoon, at 4 o'clock. And what said Sir Edmund? That I should accept it by Tuesday, or he would put me out of the house upon Wednesday. Ah. Poirot returned the paper to her with a small bow. Thank you, mademoiselle. You have been more honest than the company. We shall remember it. She took the paper back without looking at it, and her hand, the one with the reddened knuckles, was trembling now, not from fear, but from the slow late arrival of a feeling she had postponed for 4 years. In the corner of the morning room mantelpiece, where Hodges had set out 2 small brass candlesticks for the evening's use, the left-hand one stood a 1/4 inch in advance of its twin. Section 7. Poirot noted the brass candlesticks, and noted also that he had not himself moved them, and that Hodges, of all men, would not have set them down crooked. He filed the small fact away in the small precise drawer of his mind where the small precise facts of the evening had begun to multiply. Miss Vane was permitted to withdraw. She rose with the careful balance of a woman walking a narrow plank above a river, and at the door she paused and turned and said, without quite addressing either of them, "I did not kill him." "No, mademoiselle," said Poirot quietly. "I do not believe you did." She left. Japp blew out his breath. £3,000, cast out on Wednesday, plenty of motive, Poirot, plenty. Plenty, mon ami. And yet a woman who has just refused £3,000 at 4 o'clock in the afternoon does not, at 7:30, plunge a paper knife into the man who offered it. She is more likely to weep, or to write a letter she will not post, or to plan with great care to be elsewhere when retribution arrives. She does not, mon ami, perform the act between the gong and the soup. Then who, Poirot? Master Rupert? Master Rupert is the obvious answer. Sir Edmund, by his half-written letter, intended to alter his will. The codicil unwritten is an inheritance preserved. The motive is, what shall we say, wholesale. Yet I find a wholesale motive often comes wrapped in a wholesale alibi. Let us see Master Rupert, and before him Mademoiselle Cordelia. Japp lifted his eyebrows. The niece? She was at the table. She was at the table, but she has not slept the night before, mon ami. She wore at tea a small jet brooch which she does not wear now. She has a thread of cream notepaper caught in her sleeve. She has been crying before the scream. There are several questions to which I should like the politeness of an answer. Cordelia came in with the unsteady step of a girl who has been holding her breath. She sat upon the edge of the chair, her freckles standing out like ink spots on a clean tablecloth. "Mademoiselle," said Poirot gently, "you are a witness. Will you tell us what you have not yet told?" I do not know what you mean." The wallpaper above the writing desk shows the ghost of a picture lately removed. What picture was it? A miniature, a portrait of my mother. It hung there since I was a child. It was removed this afternoon, by Uncle Edmund. He said it had no business above his writing desk. He said I was to take it with me when I went. You were going then? When? Tomorrow morning. And the reason for your going? A long silence. Mademoiselle, said Poirot, softer still, I am not the magistrate. I am only an old man who has seen a great deal of unhappiness, and who has learned that nothing makes it worse than the keeping of it. Cordelia put her hands over her face. He had asked me to marry him. Japp's pencil stopped. He had told me, she went on in the muffled voice of one speaking into a pillow, that he would divorce my aunt, that there were grounds, he said, and that he would marry me, and that I should be mistress of Ravensmere. He told me on Sunday. He gave me until the tomorrow to answer. This afternoon I told him no. I told him no, Monsieur Poirot, and I asked him to let me go, and he laughed, and he said that I should be sorry, that no one in this house would have a penny but as he chose, and then he took down the miniature and gave it to me and said, Take your mother with you then. She was the only one of you who had any sense. She lowered her hands. Her eyes had the brittle clarity of a window in winter. I went to my room, I wept, I packed. At 7 I dressed for dinner, and I came down because to remain upstairs would have been to invite questions I could not answer. I did not kill him. No, mademoiselle. I do not believe you did. He let a small silence rest upon her, gentle as a hand. Then, the jet brooch, mademoiselle, the one you wore at tea, and do not wear now. She looked down at her empty collar. I gave it back to him, at 4 o'clock. It had been my mother's. He had had it set. I would not keep his settings. Where did you give it back? In the drawing room, upon his writing desk. I laid it beside the inkwell. Beside the inkwell? Repeated Poirot softly. I see. Thank you, mademoiselle. You may go. She rose, hesitated, and at the door turned. Monsieur Poirot, is it terribly wicked of me that I am not sorry? It is human, mademoiselle. The wicked, in my experience, are almost always sorry. They are sorry to have been caught, whereas the innocent are sorry for the dead, even when the dead have given them no occasion to grieve. Go now, she went. When the door had closed, Japp said very quietly, The jet brooch is not on the desk, Poirot. I looked carefully, in the drawer beneath the blotter, behind the lamp. There is no brooch. No, mon ami. And that, I think, is the most interesting fact of the evening. A brooch laid upon a desk at 4 o'clock and absent at 7:45 has been taken. The question is not where it went, mon ami. It is what it told the hand that took it. Section 8. More interesting than £3,000 and a codicil, said Japp, who was a fair man and liked to be told why. Considerably more, mon ami. £3,000 is a motive. A codicil is a motive. They are large public motives. They walk in upon the case in evening dress and present their cards. But a jet brooch upon a writing desk at 4 o'clock and not upon a writing desk at 7:45, that is a small private motive, and the small private motives, mon ami, are the ones that kill. You think someone took the brooch? I think someone saw the brooch, saw it, understood it, and was, what is the word, undone by it. Send for Master Rupert. Rupert Marchmont came in with the easy stride of a man who has decided to be amused by the situation. He took the chair, threw one knee over the other, and produced a cigarette case from his breast pocket, the very article, presumably, for which he had absented himself from the table. May I? You may, monsieur. He lit, exhaled, and waited. Japp opened. Mr. Marchmont, you left the dining room for some 3 minutes between the gong and the scream, to fetch your cigarette case. I did. From where? From my room, Inspector. The route passes within 10 yards of the drawing-room door. You did not turn aside? I went up, I fetched the case, I came down, 3 minutes, as the Colonel says. Anyone see you? In the gallery, I cannot say, the lamps were low. Did you hear anything as you passed? A small, deliberate pause. I heard the scratch of a pen, Inspector. My stepfather writing his letter, I supposed. You are certain of this? I am certain. Poirot, in his decorative and a corner, observed Rupert with the mild expression of a man examining a portrait whose attribution he doubted. Monsieur, he said, what time did you yourself enter the dining hall this evening? 7:20, just before the gong. And before that? In the billiard-room, Inspector, knocking the balls about. I detest the half-hour before dinner. It is the most pointless 30 minutes in the English day. You were alone? Quite alone. You did not see Sir Edmund? I did not. Nor speak with him? Nor speak with him. You and he were upon what terms, monsieur? Rupert's smile widened a 1/4 inch. Upon civilized terms, Monsieur Poirot, the terms upon which a stepson and a stepfather contrive to share a house when neither can afford to leave it. There was no warmth, there was no rupture. There was adequacy. Adequacy, it is a fine English word, he paused. You knew of the proposed codicil? I had heard of it. From my stepfather, he said he had not made up his mind. And the burden of the codicil? Divert the estate from myself to my cousin Cordelia, on the ground that I am, in his view, a wastrel. And had he made up his mind, monsieur? That, Monsieur Poirot, is what we now shall never know. Poirot regarded him. On the contrary, monsieur, he said quietly, it is precisely what we do know. He had made up his mind. He had begun the letter to his solicitor. He had used the word decision. It is the unfinished word in the sentence upon the desk. Rupert's cigarette paused at his lip a half-second longer than smoking required. Indeed, he said. Then I am, as they say, ruined. You are inconvenienced, monsieur. It comes to much the same thing in my circle. In your circle, monsieur, no doubt. Tell me, when you entered the gallery this evening, passing, as you say, within 10 yards of the drawing-room door, did you observe whether that door stood open or closed? A pause. Closed, Monsieur Poirot. Quite closed? Quite. And on your descent? closed still. Poirot rose from his corner and moved with the soft tread of a man choosing his ground. Monsieur, the housemaid Annie, who found the body, has been very kind in her account. She entered the drawing-room at 7:45 to draw the curtains. She entered, she says, through the door from the hall. She did not, she says, touch anything but the curtain cord. And she screamed. As one would, said Rupert, as one would. Yet I notice, monsieur, that when one screams in a closed room one is heard by oneself. To be heard by the dining hall, across the breadth of a corridor and through 2 closed doors, one must scream in a room which is no longer quite so closed. Rupert's smile became, for the first time that evening, a careful artifact. I do not follow. I think you do, monsieur. The drawing-room door was open when the maid Annie screamed, for otherwise her scream could not have reached us. The door was therefore opened between your descent and her scream. By whom, and to what purpose? By the maid, surely, on entering. Doors close behind those who enter, monsieur. They do not remain politely ajar to broadcast distress. A small silence. Then by Sir Edmund, said Rupert. Sir Edmund was already dead, monsieur. A smaller silence. Then I cannot say. You cannot say, monsieur, or you do not wish to say? He did not answer. Poirot's eyes had drifted while he spoke to the small mantelpiece of the morning-room. The 2 brass candlesticks stood there still. The left-hand one was 1/4 inch in advance of its twin. A small thing, a small telling thing. Section 9, Rupert's silence, having been observed, became a thing he could not easily reclaim. He recovered it as a man recovers a dropped hat, too quickly, with too much smile. Monsieur Poirot, he said, I have, I think, answered with patience. May I now be permitted to mourn my stepfather in some quieter room? You may, monsieur. You may mourn him in any room you choose. But you will not, I think, leave this house tonight. I had not intended to. That is fortunate. The roads are very poor at this season. Rupert rose. At the door he hesitated, and Poirot, watching the line of his shoulders, observed that the hesitation cost him a small visible effort, like a man steadying himself before a step on ice. Monsieur Poirot, am I to take it that I am suspected? Monsieur, you are to take it that you are observed. It is the precondition of all justice. Good night. He went. When the door had closed, Japp tapped his pencil against his teeth, a habit which his superintendent had several times begged him to abandon. Well, Poirot, he's our man. The codicil, the 3 minutes, the cigarette case story, the open door, and now he won't say who opened it. He will not say, mon ami, because he does not know. Doesn't know. He suspects, but he does not know, and the suspicion is, what shall we say, inconvenient to him. To name it would be to confess a thing about himself which he prefers to the gallows. What thing? That, mon ami, I shall not yet say. Poirot's small smile was very gentle. But I shall ask you to send for one more witness, the Reverend Mr. Asprey. The vicar. The vicar. He has said nothing all evening. He has murmured prayers. He has dabbed his moustache. He has waited. Such men are full of information, mon ami, if one asks them the questions for which they have been waiting. The Reverend Mr. Asprey came in. He was a thin, soft-voiced man of 60, with the slightly stooped shoulders of one who had spent half his life leaning over invalids' beds and the other half over sermons. He sat where he was placed. Mr. Asprey, said Poirot kindly, you were at dinner this evening as the guest of Lady Marchmont. I was, Monsieur Poirot. You have been vicar of this parish how long? 23 years. You knew Sir Edmund well. As well, sir, as any clergyman knows a man who attends his church 4 times a year and his sermons not at all. Tell me, Mr. Asprey, was there any matter in recent weeks upon which Sir Edmund consulted you in your professional capacity? The vicar's pale eyes settled upon Poirot with the steady attention of a man who has been waiting for a particular question. There was, on Tuesday last. He came to the vicarage and asked me whether the Church of England, in his particular circumstances, would receive him into communion again if he were to put away his wife. And your reply? I told him, sir, that the Church of England would not. He laughed and said, Then the Church of England and I shall part company more amicably than my wife and I shall. Did he speak of grounds, monsieur? He alluded to them. He spoke of an attachment of long standing on his wife's part to a person not himself. He did not name the person. He said only that the person was, and I quote him with sorrow, too small for the part. Poirot was very still. "Too small for the part," he repeated softly. "Thank you, Mr. Asprey. You have been of great assistance." "I have, sir, done my duty as I conceived it. I confess that I am uneasy." "Be at ease, monsieur. You have done no harm." The vicar withdrew. When the door had closed, Japp said, "Lady Marchmont." "Lady Marchmont, yes, but not in the way you imagine, mon ami." "In what way, then?" Poirot did not at once answer. He rose. He moved with that small considerate tread to the morning-room mantelpiece. He stood before the 2 brass candlesticks. He regarded them. He extended one gloved finger, and, with the smallest possible nudge, pressed the left-hand candlestick a 1/4 inch backward into perfect symmetry with its twin. He stepped back. The room continued obstinately to feel disordered. "Mon ami," he said, "the disorder is not in the candlesticks. It has never been in the candlesticks. The candlesticks are only where the disorder settles, as dust settles upon the flattest surface in the room. Wherever this disorder passes, it leaves the same small mark, a 1/4 inch out of true. I have observed it in the dining hall, I have observed it in the drawing room, I have observed it here. The disorder walks, mon ami. It walks from room to room. It has done so all evening." "You mean—" "The murderer walks from room to room. I mean more than that. I mean that the murderer cannot help it. There is in this person a small compulsive correction, an arranging hand which is forever setting things forward by precisely the wrong measure. A hand which restores order according to a private and incorrect rule. It is the signature, mon ami, of one particular kind of mind, a mind which has spent its life standing slightly to one side and arranging the world to be slightly more comfortable for itself," Japp considered. "A servant? No, mon ami. A servant arranges according to the rule of the house. This hand arranges according to the rule of itself. It is the hand of a person who has lived in this house for years, and has never been quite at home in it, and has been forever, by half measures, by 1/4 inches, making it bear them." He turned. "Send Hodges, mon ami. We shall assemble the household. The time has come." Section 10. Hodges, summoned, received his instructions with the impassive courtesy of a man who has been asked to organise a funeral and a fancy dress ball, with equal efficiency. He withdrew. There followed, in the small ordered intervals of a well-trained house, the sounds of a household being gathered, a tread upon the stair, a door upon the gallery, a low voice in the hall, another and another. While these sounds composed themselves into a procession, Poirot stood at the morning-room window and looked out into the October dark. A wet wind had risen. The elms beyond the lawn moved their heavy heads as though to disapprove. "Mon ami," he said, without turning, "I shall require one final small favour. A telephone call to London, to the offices of Mr. Henshaw in Lincoln's Inn. The line, I think, will still be open if we are quick." Japp went out and was gone perhaps 4 minutes. When he returned, his round red face was rounder and redder, and he was breathing in the brisk, satisfied manner of a man who has just received a confirmation he had hoped for and slightly dreaded. "Henshaw says," he reported, "that Sir Edmund spoke with him by telephone at 5 o'clock this afternoon. Sir Edmund said he was about to write a letter which would entirely instruct his London solicitor on the matter of the codicil. He said, and Henshaw is quite firm, 'My mind, Henshaw, is at last made up. You will hear by morning's post the precise terms. They will surprise you.' And then he rang off." "Surprise you," repeated Poirot. "Surprise. It is the operative word, mon ami. The codicil would have surprised. Yet everyone in this house had assumed that the codicil would do what? Divert the estate from Master Rupert to Miss Cordelia. Precisely. And so they had assumed because Sir Edmund himself had let it be understood. He had spoken of it in such terms. Even to Master Rupert, in passing, he had said as much. The whole household believed the same thing, that the codicil would punish Rupert and reward Cordelia. And it wouldn't? It would have done neither, mon ami. Sir Edmund had made up his mind upon quite another matter. He had decided to divorce his wife. Japp whistled. He had decided to divorce his wife, mon ami, and to marry his niece Cordelia. The codicil was not to be a question of inheritance. It was to be a question of preparation, the legal scaffolding by which a man means, in his 58th year, to put aside one wife and take another. That is what would have surprised Mr. Henshaw. That is what surprised Sir Edmund himself, perhaps, when he decided it. And that, mon ami, is what made it intolerable to Lady Marchmont. To Lady Marchmont, yes, but not in the way you imagine. Lady Marchmont, mon ami, has carried for 7 years the knowledge that her husband was, what shall we say, not adequate to her. She has carried it with the magnificent composure of a great lady. She has not killed him for it. She has not even greatly wished to. She has endured. Endurance, mon ami, is the chief English virtue, and it does not as a rule lead to murder. Then we must look elsewhere. We must look, mon ami, to the person who could not endure, to the person who had spent 4 years being too small for the part, to the person who had loved Sir Edmund, secretly, faithfully, painfully, and who had been informed by Sir Edmund himself that her usefulness was concluded, that her presence was inconvenient, and that her departure would be encouraged by means of a £3,000 settlement and a Wednesday morning train. Miss Vane, mon ami? No, I do not believe Miss Vane murdered Sir Edmund. Then who, Poirot? In God's name? In God's name, mon ami, we shall hear in 5 minutes. Let us go down. They went down. The drawing-room, at Poirot's quiet direction, had been reopened. Sir Edmund's body had been removed by the police surgeon during the hour past, and only the small dark stain upon the hearthrug remembered him. The chairs had been arranged in a wide half-circle facing the writing-desk. A fire had been built up. The lamps had been lit. Upon the mantelpiece the 2 silver candlesticks stood, one of them still a 1/4 inch in advance of its twin. The household entered in order. Lady Marchmont, very pale, very upright, taking the chair at the centre. Cordelia at her right, white-knuckled. Rupert at her left, with the careful, composed face of a man preparing to be acquitted. Miss Vane upon the chair beyond Cordelia, hands folded, head a little bent, the Reverend Mr. Asprey beside Rupert, hands also folded, Colonel Pettigrew, who refused to sit at all, taking up a position by the door with military patience, and Mr. Quince, the solicitor, who took the last chair of the half-circle with the air of a man preparing to make notes. Hodges withdrew, the door closed. Poirot stood by the writing-desk. The half-written letter to Mr. Henshaw still lay there, untouched, the pen beside it now dried. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said softly, "in this hour I shall ask of you only one thing, that you listen. I shall not ask any of you to speak until I have finished. When I have finished, I shall ask one of you a single question, and that question, ladies and gentlemen, will require an answer of precisely 4 words." He paused. Upon the mantel, the left-hand candlestick, though no hand had touched it for the better part of an hour, appeared in the firelight more out of true than ever before. "Let us begin," said Hercule Poirot, "with the candlesticks. Section 11, the final gathering." "Let us begin with the candlestick," said Hercule Poirot, "for they have been telling me their small, persistent story all evening. One candlestick upon this mantel stands a 1/4 inch in advance of its twin. This is not the only such pair in the house. There is a pair in the dining hall, a pair in the morning room. In every room where this household has assembled, one candlestick has stood a 1/4 inch out of true. I corrected one. It returned. I corrected another. It returned. The candlesticks have been arranged by a hand which goes from room to room putting things very slightly wrong, in the conviction that it is putting them very slightly right. That is the first rung. The second. Sir Edmund was struck down between the gong and the scream. The clock upon this mantel was stopped at 7:31, deliberately, to establish the hour of the murder, because at the true hour, some minutes earlier, the murderer had no alibi. The third. The silver sand-pot which had stood upon Sir Edmund's desk for 40 years was gone. The murderer had used another, containing black sand of Italian origin. I have grains of it here, drawn from the grate. That black sand belongs to the pot from the secretaire in the small parlour. The fourth. Miss Cordelia returned this afternoon a small jet brooch. She laid it upon his writing-desk. When the body was found, the brooch was gone. The brooch was taken by the murderer because it told him a thing he had not until that moment known, that Cordelia had refused Sir Edmund, that the proposed divorce was now only the vanity of a fading man, and Sir Edmund, alive, was an inconvenience to no one but himself. It is the cruellest rung, for it tells me the murderer killed Sir Edmund after learning the thing which made the murder unnecessary. A small dreadful silence had entered the room. The fifth, Mr. Asprey was told by Sir Edmund, last Tuesday, of an attachment of long standing on Lady Marchmont's part to a person, too small for the part. I misunderstood the remark. I suppose Sir Edmund to mean inferior station. He meant inferior stature, a literal smallness, a solicitor's stoutness. The 6th. Mr. Quince was in the library from 6:30, yet between 6:45 and the gong no one observed him. The library communicates by a green baize door with the small parlour, and thence with the drawing-room. A man might pass from one to the other without entering the hall. The 7th. Lady Marchmont has known Mr. Quince since girlhood. He had every reason to know the codicil concerned not inheritance but divorce, and every reason to fear that a divorce would expose the 7 years' attachment between himself and the woman who had endured Sir Edmund without loving him. The 8th. Mr. Quince passed through the small parlour at 7:20, taking the silver sand-pot. He entered the drawing-room. He saw the jet brooch beside the inkwell, and understood in one cold instant that Cordelia had refused, and that the divorce was no longer his ruin. He hesitated, and then he killed Sir Edmund anyway. Not because divorce still threatened him, but because Sir Edmund had, by the simple act of proposing it, shown him in the mirror of another man's contempt that he was too small for the part, and that no man forgives. He struck. He sanded the unfinished letter with his own black sand, a habit he could not, even in murder, prevent. He took the brooch. He stopped the clock at 7:31. He returned by the green baize door to the library, and at the gong came into dinner. Mr. Quince had not moved. His hands rested upon his knees, very still. Poirot stepped closer. "Mr. Quince, in your pocket, sir, lies the jet brooch which once belonged to Cordelia's mother. I shall not ask you to produce it. I shall ask only one question. It requires 4 words, no more, no less." The room did not breathe. "Mr. Quince, why did you straighten?" "For the smallest fraction of a second, Mr." Quince's eyes went, by the long compulsion of an arranging hand, to the crook candlestick upon the mantel. They flicked to it. They flicked away. He did not speak. He did not need to. In that single involuntary glance, the glance of the hand that had moved through every room of the house this evening, setting things a 1/4 inch wrong, the case was complete. Lady Marchmont very softly began to weep, not for her husband, but for the careful man who had ruined them both. Mr. Quince lowered his head. I do not know," he whispered. And those indeed were 4 words. Poirot bowed. "It is the answer of every murderer, monsieur. None of them ever does." He turned to Japp, who was already moving. "Mon ami," he said quietly, "he is yours." Outside, the October wind had risen. Within, the fire crackled, and the 2 silver candlesticks stood, one still by the smallest measure, in advance of its twin. Poirot regarded them a long moment. He did not, this time, correct the disorder. He understood at last that the disorder had never been in the candlesticks. It had been in the small vain heart of a man who had spent 30 years standing slightly to one side of another man's life, and had at last decided that the inconvenience of being unloved was greater than that of being hanged. "Mesdames, messieurs," he said softly, "we are none of us, in the end, large enough for our parts. It is only that some of us have the grace to know it, and to bear it, and not to take up a paper knife in the matter." He inclined his head to Lady Marchmont, to Cordelia, and to Miss Vane, who had at last raised her own. Then Hercule Poirot took up his small neat hat and his small neat stick and went out into the October night, leaving the candlesticks as they were,